last years, we have organized several lectures based on science and in particular on astronomy. As you can see here, the first one was about astronomy, then we switched to the theory of relativity, then astronautics, then quantum physics, and lastly, last year we talked about science communication itself. And one of the lecturers of last year that probably you remember was my friend and colleague Giulio Nicolò Carlone, and I asked him to coordinate this year the whole series of lectures. So I'm very happy to see a very crowded place. I'm very happy to sit beside Professor Telmo Pievani, but I will let Giulio introduce him. So thank you everybody, and enjoy the lesson.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Simone. Thank you. And thanks to all the students of Collegio. I'm Giulio Nicolò Carlone. I'm a consultant. I'm studying history of science. I'm part of Physical Pub. And as you can see from the slide behind me, this year, Collegio, Physical Pub, and Pikaia have put together a truly unique journey, something never done before, based on your requests. And this is my honor for me to try to explain every single stage of this journey. Today we have the honor and the privilege of welcoming here Professor Telmo Pievani, philosopher, evolutionist, and visiting scientist at the American Museum of Natural History of New York. Then we have Maurizio Casiraghi, full professor of zoology at Università Milanesi Bicocca, will guide us through what is often referred to as the sixth extinction. And then Marco Ferragutti, evolutionist from University of Milan. And Marco will take us into the fascinating world of symbiosis and its natural history. And then Chiara Ceci, fellow of the Linnean Society, and following and joining us from Cambridge, and will lead us into the garden of discovery, in a Darwin experience. And then Maria Grazia Portera from University of Florence will explore the role of aesthetics in biodiversity conservation strategies. And then at the end, Elena Canadelli from the Department of History of Science at the University of Padua. And we will discuss about the challenge of digitizing natural history collection. So as you can see, an amazing journey ahead of us. But before starting, I just want to thank again Giancarlo Lacchini from Collegio and Stefano Dalla Casa and Mauro Mandrioli from Pikaia, who've been essential in making these events and this moment possible. So now I let the stage to you and to the students of the Collegio, and so we can start and let the evolutionary wave begin. Thank you very much.
Okay, now I'm going to introduce the Professor Pievani. I'm going to give you some details about his life, his professional life. He's a full professor at University of Padua. He teaches philosophy of biological sciences and also bioethics and legislation on biotechnology. He studied at Liceo Classico and got a degree in philosophy of sciences at Università Statale degli Studi di Milano, and got a PhD at Università di Palermo. He basically studied evolution in a lot of its forms, and he started his career as a professor at Università Bicocca, and now tonight we have the possibility to ask him a lot of questions about evolution and his work, basically. So now I'm starting with a question, a general question. Can you give us a definition of evolution, and also which are the main evolutionary models right now?
Great, thank you, Silvia, and welcome to everybody. It's great to be here, and I'm so happy to be at the beginning of this new series of lessons for you, and I'm also happy that you decided to select evolution this time and not just astrophysics and physics as always to discuss about science. So I'm happy about that. So as you have heard, I'm working now at the American Museum of Natural History in New York. So I'm a strange kind of philosopher of science. I'm a philosopher of biology, but my main publications are in science because I work in macroevolution. That is a part of the evolutionary explanation. I study phylogeny. That is a technical term in order to explain the genealogical relationships between species. And mainly, I apply all this stuff to human evolution. So I'm an expert in human evolution and human phylogeny. So maybe you have heard something about Homo sapiens cohabitation with Neanderthals or Denisovans or other human species, or human migration. And we study human migration and we mix together. It's wonderful because it's a really interdisciplinary field. And now I'm coming back to the answer to the first question. It's a way to work mixing together in a model genetic data, paleontological data, archaeological data, cultural data, linguistic data. So it's a very interdisciplinary field. So it's amazing, and I invite you to study and to be interested in this field. It's not easy to explain how evolution works in few words. Evolution, the theory of evolution is not just a theory. It's not just a model. It's what we call a research program. So it's a mix. It's a set of different explanations. We have a core of this explanation that we call natural selection. Natural selection is not just one kind of process. It's a set of different processes because you can have natural selection, sexual selection, group selection, or pair selection, and so on. So you can have different kinds of selective processes, but mainly at the core of this explanation, you always have a production of diversity, of varieties. So genetic mutations, epigenetic mutations. So you need a source of variation. And this kind of variation, we usually call it random, just because, not because it doesn't have causes, it doesn't have agents able to produce mutations, but because these mutations are not produced by the environment directly, so not structured by the environment. So this is the first raw material of any evolutionary change. In order to have evolution, you need individual diversity. You need individuals, entities, that could be groups, individuals, genes, or whatever, at different hierarchical levels, but you need entities able to produce and to carry variations, okay, mutations that are unique of an individual. That's the basic point. The second point, you have an environment, and the environment put what we call selective pressures. So depending on the mutation and diversity that you can have different chance of survival and reproduction in an environment. And so what happens is that a selective pressure generates a different frequency, or if you prefer, a different success of a mutation, of a variation, rather than others. So natural selection is something like a sorting of variations. And this is the core of any evolutionary explanation. This is, folks, as you know, what Darwin taught us, and in quite 2 centuries ago, one century and a half ago. But this is just the core of the theory, because now we know much more. We have what we call today an enlarged, so a more pluralistic explanation of evolution. For example, a couple of examples. For example, we know that in evolution we can have very random processes. For example, genetic drift. Genetic drift is a random sampling of genetic variation due to ecological perturbances or situation in which you have a population that has the run through a bottleneck, so a great rapid restriction of the population. You can have disasters or ecological disruptions. In this case, the final result is just a rapid, random sorting of genetic variation and the end of the process. This is something non-Darwinian, because Darwin was unable to understand something like that. Darwin knew nothing about genes and chromosomes. He knew nothing about the molecular basis of evolution. And this is strange because he was nevertheless able to explain evolution from thanks to his observation. So not knowing the molecular basis, so bottom up, the basis of evolution. It doesn't matter. Today we know the molecular basis, and they are just the basis needed for an evolutionary and Darwinian explanation. So you have genetic drift. You can have macroevolution. That is what I studied mainly. So the fact, for example, that you can have the formation of an ecological barrier. So you have a population in a geographical range in evolution, a human species or a mammal species in Africa or whatever. And it could happen that due to a migration to an island or due to an ecological barrier, you have a separation, usually quite rapid separation, for example, of a small population. And in this case, the small population will accumulate different mutations, genetic mutation, different adaptations, and quite rapidly it became a new species. Okay, it can become new species. In this case, you have a geographic speciation. This is another very important process and pattern in evolution. So this is the very basic of what is the evolution. So it's a production of novelties, change. Evolution means change, means transformation. It doesn't mean progress, because philosophically speaking, progress is a much more demanding idea. So it should mean that you have a direction of the process, but this is not the case in evolution. My preferred definition of evolution is an exploration of possibilities, okay? The main philosophical point of evolution is not necessity, it's possibility. So it's an exploration of contingent ecological situation case by case. And we as Homo sapiens, we are the result of such a contingent, wonderful exploration of possibilities. We as humans, we are a very young species. We have no more than 300,000 years of history, so nothing in terms of evolution. So far, we had no more than 50, 60,000 generations in our story, so nothing. So 60,000 passages between mother and son, so just this number. So we are a very young species, and we own our evolution exactly to environment, to natural selection, to the cohabitation with other human species, and to all this kind of patterns. So rather than in physics, when you have just a formula and you have a universal law, in evolution, you have different patterns of explanation, and case by case, you have to mix together natural selection, genetic drift, and other patterns, case by case. So it's a different way of working. We have something like a toolkit of patterns, and case by case, we use this toolkit, and we confirm the validity of this pattern case by case. So it's a very complex, amazing, and for me, wonderful field of research. And of course, just the last thing, what is quite more complicated rather than physics, but now you have also in physics the evolution of the universe. But in the case of evolution, we studied the past. So we studied something already happened. So we don't have the time machine. We are not able to come back and to repeat the experiment of the extinction of dinosaurs. It's impossible to do that. So it's something like a science based of a collection of different data in order to reconstruct the past. So we have to explain something already happened. So it's an historical science. It's an historical experimental science. So it's interesting, because if you are an evolutionist, it's not enough that you explain something in terms of proximate causes. So proximate causes means that you are observing an eye or a leg or an organ, a structure, or your brain, and you describe how your eyes and your brain work. This is the proximate causes. This is the field of medicine or biochemistry or cellular biology and whatever. We, as evolutionary biologists, we have to add another layer of explanation. For us, proximate causes are not enough. It's just the first part of our job. The second part is the most demanding, most difficult, is to explain remote causes. So the other question that always we have is why? So why we had the evolution of an eye this way, why we had the evolution of the eye in the animal kingdom more than 35 times in different parallel lines. So we have to explain this why. And when you have to explain this why in terms of remote causes, the story becomes more and more difficult. So, but also very, very interesting and challenging. So this is our job. We have to explain the remote causes of what happened in the past in order to better understand the present.
Okay, as you have said before, the concept of evolution often comes with the concept of progress. And I would like to ask you to talk more specifically about the relationship between these two concepts. If you would like.
Yeah, it's a very frequent misunderstanding about evolution. Maybe you know very well, and you can check online. If you put in the Google browser, for example, human evolution, you will find thousands of the same image about evolution. So the ape that becomes more and more that can stand upright, and then he loses hair, and then he's able to manage something and then the brain grows and grows and grows, and at the end, usually on the right part of this track, you have the optimum of the evolution that should be Homo sapiens. This is the very famous misunderstanding and very successful misunderstanding about evolution. This image is completely wrong for many reasons. The main reason is that evolution never occurs through a single line. Okay, evolution is a branching process. So it's a tree, the tree of life. So you have common ancestors, and then you have branching diversification. So never a single ladder, never a single mainstream of change, quite never, and quite always you have a species, another species, subspecies, extinction, speciation, branching evolution. And this is true also for the human evolution. It never happened in the 6 million years that last after the separation with the common ancestor with chimps. It never happened in our evolution in 6 million of years that we have just one species alone. The only exception is today. Okay, since 45,000 years ago, we are the only human species on Earth, but this is an absolutely exception in our history. Okay, until few millennia ago, few tens of millennia ago, in Europe, in Eurasia, in Eastern Asia, we had at least 5 human species together. Okay, so 5 branches. This is the first reason why the idea of linear progress is wrong. The second one is that even if you think about one species that is in one period of evolution and another one that is more recent, so in a more recent period of time, you cannot think that automatically the second species should be better than the previous species. Okay, so in evolution you have no direction of change. So the species that you observe in a more recent time not necessarily is more intelligent or more complex or more or fitter or something like that with respect to the previous one. What you observe very frequently in evolution is a species that is very long, is very old, and can be very stable and can change a little bit, that can last for a very long time. Then you have small species, young species with different traits. So cohabitations, and again, exploration of possibilities, not something like a march of improvement, okay? This is not true in evolution. And the third reason why the progress is wrong, it is very misleading in evolution. If you think, this is a more philosophical point, if you think that evolution is a progress, you have to choose and we have to share together what we mean by progress, in the sense that we should find something like a criterion of progress. And I can challenge you, we can discuss a lot about what kind of criterion should be. For example, intelligence. The degree of intelligence of a species could be a matter, could be a degree of progress. It depends on how you define intelligence. Okay, if you define intelligent has the ability to be for a long time in this planet, and if you observe evolution from the perspective of an extraterrestrial intelligence, this is our usual experiment of mind experiment, and in an alien mind should think that plants and bacteria and microbes are the more resistant and more adapted forms of life on this planet, not humans. So another possible criterion could be complexity. Usually we use complexity as a criterion of possible progress. But again, it depends of your perspective. Complexity that we define, you will discuss maybe with Marco Ferragutti or Maurizio Casiraghi. Complexity anyway in evolution is the number of parts that you have in a system and the number of relationships that you can observe between the parts. Okay, this is complexity. Okay, but again, in evolution, if you look at the whole biodiversity of life, more than 4 parts on 5 of species on Earth are just unicellular species. So species with just one cell. Then you have multicellular life like animals and some plants. But this is not, we cannot think that this is the purpose of evolution to produce complexity again. So it's very hard to find a criterion of progress. So for all these reasons, I suggest not to use progress as a criterion to understand evolution. You have also an additional program when you explain evolution, is that you have something like a view from the present to the past. Think about that. When you explain evolution, and mainly when you explain human evolution, you know already how the story went. So where the story went. So where the story is today. We are here. This is our present. And our mind is quite automatically predisposed to think that the past should justify this present. But this is a very hard philosophical mistake. Okay? The present is not the criterion to explain the past. The past is something happened in the past, and the present is not the reason for that past. Okay? So in evolution, you have not to think in terms of this is the present and have to explain the past. You have to revert the perspective and to think the past before, and then through this past you can explain all the bifurcations or the ramification of the story, and you can understand that this present is just one of the possible present, not the only necessary and only needed present that we could have with respect to the past. So a lot of mistakes, a lot of biases that you can have when you study evolution.
Okay. Do you have any question? Okay.
Yeah.
So first of all, thank you for coming here. Personally, I want you to know that me and also other people in this class, like my sister Chiara Cozzolino, like personally I was reading Pikaia since middle school, so it's a bit...
Great, thank you so much, thank you.
And I wanted to ask you whether, like, I stopped reading, no, I read biology a lot when I was a kid, I continue to read, but I stopped like having a clear picture, like I read, okay, the question is...
But you stopped to study biology and then? What did you...
economics. So
Economics, okay. Another very complex field.
Like John Maynard Smith may...
Exactly.
I was wondering, what do you think is the frontier of evolutionary studies today? Like, I read a lot of Dawkins, Stephen Jay Gould, John Maynard Smith, and also a bit of Lynn Margulis. So I had the perception that there was a discussion about macroevolution, which was like the difference between a gene-based evolution or group selection, the importance of constraints, and also the importance of alternative mechanisms with respect to adaptation and natural selection. So Margulis was talking about symbiosis and that kind of stuff. But then, since I'm not in the field, and few people here are in the field, I think maybe nobody here is in the field, I was wondering, what are the main issues today? Like, which debates have you leave apart, and which debates are you still considering today, and which new debates have opened?
Sure. You will see some of this discussion. For example, you will discuss about, with Maurizio Casiraghi is a great expert in symbiosis, so you have to discuss with him. Also, Marco Ferragutti will discuss about symbiosis. Symbiosis is one of the examples of this updating, very important updating that we have today about for the theory of evolution. Basically, what is happening today is that we are expanding the theory. When you say expanding a theory, it doesn't mean that you are refuting the core of the theory. So the core of the theory is what I explained before. So it's the basic idea of variation and natural selection. But when I explained before this idea, I already introduced a more pluralistic idea of variation and natural selection. So according to Dawkins and to the standard neo-Darwinian theory, mutations should be just genetic mutations. But today we know that genetic mutations are just a part of the story. We can have epigenetic mutations, so mutations that occur not on the sequence, but on the regulation of the genes, okay? So the expression of the gene. These are very important. Natural selection works a lot in the past on epigenetic mutations, and we know today that in plants very frequently, and sometimes in animals, these epigenetic alleles could be inherited, so could be transmitted in a weak way for few generations in animals, more stably in plants. But anyway, it's an additional source of variation. Today, we know that, for example, horizontal gene transfer is another important way to produce variation, because many forms of life, mainly bacteria, but not only bacteria, are able to exchange directly in a horizontal way genetic material, producing recombination and variation. So these are all fields that were unknown to Darwin, of course, but unknown also to Dawkins and to the supporters of what we call the neo-Darwinian theory of the past century. So this is examples of extension. These extensions are in the core of the Darwinian explanation. Then we have extension that could be outside the core. One is genetic drift that I explained before. It's a completely random process of sorting of mutations, okay? That should be included in the theory of evolution. Other two examples are the role of constraints that today are very, very important. For example, we know today that natural selection doesn't work from scratch, doesn't work from zero, but always it starts from already existing material. So natural selection has to find case by case trade-offs with the constraints of the material. And these constraints could be physical constraints, could be architectural constraints, the symmetries, the structure of the body, for example, of the animals, the body plans, could be developmental constraints. So the constraints that you have in the development of the organism. There are many kinds of constraints. So this is a new field in evolution that is very important. Maybe you know something about the Evo-Devo, so the approach of evolution through the understanding of the evolution of the developmental systems. So today, development is much more central in the evolution explanation than before. That's another very important point. For me, I study, for example, now I'm writing for the MIT in Boston a monography about acceptation. Acceptation is a very important process in evolution that was understood by Darwin in the last edition of The Origin of Species, when he explained the evolution of very complex and very subtly organized organs in the evolution. And Darwin understood that pure natural selection was not enough in order to explain the really complex structure in life, for example, wings or the eyes or lungs or very complex organs. Darwin understood that natural selection working in a gradual way, piece by piece, it was unable to explain the evolution of such complex organs. For example, if you think of a wing, the wing is a very complex structure. And you could think that wing evolved for the flight. but it's absolutely a mistake. Wings didn't evolve for flight. Wings were already existing. Wings were previously existing structures related to other functions, natural selection. You will discuss with Maria Grazia Portera about sexual selection, so aesthetics. They had feathers, they were colored, so they were used for sexual selection, for thermoregulation, for balancing of running, so for architectural reasons, and then wings have been reused for flight, so for a different function, okay? Before for gliding and for the open flight in the atmosphere. And so dinosaurs and reptiles and then birds and then bats in mammals were able to expand the ecological niche thanks to the flight. So in this case, natural selection didn't produce the structure for the function that the structure has today. Can you follow me? In this case, natural selection and other factors produced a structure for other reasons in the past, and then evolution was able to reuse, to co-opt this structure for completely different functions. And this is an idea that you can find for a philosopher also in the genealogy of ethics by Nietzsche. That's an idea that Nietzsche was able to anticipate some years after Darwin. So this idea of cooptation is another novelty in the explanation of evolution today. These are all examples of extension. Another example is symbiosis. Symbiosis is a process in which you have not competition. So it seems something anti-Darwinian, and Darwin was absolutely unaware about that. With symbiosis, you have a connection, an interconnection between different organisms that they learn to stay together. They become the same, more complex organisms, and each organism previously existing becomes a part of a more complex organisms, okay? So you will discuss about that. So mitochondria, before being just an organs again within the cell, before they were bacteria and archaebacteria, and then endosymbiosis was the process of evolution in this case. So if the question is the theory of evolution still Darwinian today? My answer will be yes, it's still Darwinian, but it's much more than Darwin and then what Darwin explained and what the Darwinians then taught, like Dawkins and others. So the theory of evolution is becoming more and more pluralistic today.
Any other questions? Okay.
What type of forces do you think at the moment are acting on us as, forces of selection? We don't compete for our survival nowadays. So what are the most important type of forces acting on our species?
Yeah, that's a very good question. That's a very good question because the evolutionary, the set of selective pressure that you can observe today is completely different with respect to the past. But anyway, even in this case, this is a process that Darwin was able to some way to understand in his last book about earthworms, when he wrote that earthworms are animals that can change the environment because they produce humus. They were able to change the soil. They are active in changing the ecological niche, and then they are able to adapt to this ecological niche, but they change the ecological niche also for other organisms. So they are what we call today niche constructor, niche builders. They are able to build in an actively way their ecological niche. And this is another novelty of the theory of evolution today. So organisms are not just and always passive entities that have to find adaptive strategies in order to survive in an always passive way. In many situations, organisms actively change the environment in order to adapt to the environment. This is true for all the what we call ecological engineers. like beavers. Beavers is my favorite example of ecological engineers, because beavers build dams, and dams is a technological artifact, very complex technological artifact, because beavers have to learn how to build dams. They have to choose exactly the moment, the specific location of the dam. So it's a very complex behavior, okay? Genetically shaped, likely, but anyway, with also an element of learning. So it's a genetic and cultural process. So beavers change the word, and then they adapt to the word, they change it. And also beavers change the word and change the selective pressures for other species. For example, in Germany, we compared the rivers with beavers and river without beavers. River with beavers, biodiversity increases for more than 30-35%, because the dams diversify the ecosystems, the habitats of different species, and so they can be more suitable for invertebrates, for amphibians, for other species. So they change the world for themselves and for others. Why I'm sharing with you these examples? Because we think that Homo sapiens is the champion of the world of the ecological change. We are the champion of the world in changing our ecological niches through artifacts, to technologies, to culture, to the shaping the landscape, to agriculture, to husbandry. Many activities are ecologically able to change our ecological niches. So for a long period in our evolution, before the Neolithic period, but even before the extinction of the other human species, this could be the right moment in the time. Before that moment, we were able to change our ecological niches without paying a cost for that. But after a period that is quite mysterious in human evolution, because we don't know exactly what happened at that time, Homo sapiens began to change the world in such a dramatic way, then Homo sapiens started to pay a cost for that change. For example, the mass extinction of great mammals in Australia and in the Americas. So it was a very aggressive behavior by Homo sapiens, by the population of Homo sapiens arriving in these continents, and so they completely exploited resources for the other generations. And that's the paradox of Homo sapiens today in evolution. So the answer to your question is that in the future, we have to expect that we will have to adapt to an environment that we shaped completely. And this means that we have to adapt our brain to our technologies, to climate change, to all the ecological changes in our ecocultural niches. So today we are the main actors of our evolution. And this is, very briefly, this is still an indirect way of evolution. So we change the world, and then we have to adapt to a world that we changed. This is also what we call today, this is a new term that we are discussing now in scientific literature. This could become what we call an evolutionary trap. Why an evolutionary trap? And this is something that is for you, for your future. Because what is happening today, and is quite unusual in evolution, very, very unusual, is that today we are quite sure that our ecological changes introduced in the past 3-4 generations, so what we call the great acceleration of the Anthropocene, these ecological changes will produce a situation for you in which you will have to adapt to a more challenging world. So your fitness will be lower than our fitness. This is an evolutionary trap. So it's something that it's very rare in evolution, and this is exactly what is happening today. It is very ironic that this is happening to the only one species on the world that called itself Homo sapiens. Okay, so Homo sapiens, able to understand. We are not able to understand. We have not been able to understand what happened. But it's still indirect. In very recent times, I study bioethics of biotechnology, and I teach this in Padua. Since 10 years, we are able today to be directly an evolutionary driver using gene editing. Because today, thanks to gene editing, we are able to introduce new genetic mutation in the germline, so in the sexual line. So if we... I'm not sure that we want.
Nice part of life.
Who is?
Everything was perfect.
Maybe.
Deborah, chiunque tu sia, mutati per favore.
Direct intervention by Silvia.
Deborah? Deborah?
Ok.
Anyway.
Non è mutata, ma ha smesso di parlare.
Sei mutata? Ok, come back.
I'm finished. Just in this case, for the first time, it's something really new in evolution. Through a technology, we can change evolution directly. And this is very challenging, but it's also could be very dangerous, because maybe we know that in China, 3 child have born with genetic mutation introduced in the embryos. So now we are able to do evolution, jumping every natural process and putting directly mutation in the germline for the first time. So that's another kind of evolution.
Has it ever happened that a species couldn't keep up with the changes that it was making on the environment, so it extinguished due to its own? Has it ever happened before?
Yeah, it's very rare, but it happens. For example, when you have invasive species, for example, you have an algae that is able to move in a new lake, and in the lake, it doesn't have competitors. In this case, you have an explosion of the population of these organisms, and you have a very rapid exploitation of all the resources in the lake. In this case, you have an invasive species that was not intelligent in human sense, because he was unable to manage the resources of the lake. So this is a case with invasive species, because the zero law of evolution of life is that when you have a living organism and you give to this organism space and energy, these organisms will multiply, will proliferate. Okay, proliferation is the basic behavior of any living system. Then, likely enough, you have environmental limitation. You have the so-called Malthusian breaks. So you have limitations. So again, evolution is always a trade-off between this push bottom-up of proliferation and the limits of the environment. So it's always a balance. When this balance is broken, you have an explosion of the population. In this case, you have the extinction of the algae in the lake due to the activity of the algae itself. Another very controversial example that is very, very interesting today, and we are working on that in Padua and in New York, is cancer cells are another example of Darwinian selfish behavior, so proliferation, uncontrolled proliferation within the body, so within a more complex system, without any possibility to give success to the organism. So you have a selfish behavior at the cell level against the survival of the organism at the higher level. In this case, it's another example of a selfish behavior that it's a suicide, because at the end also the cancer cells will disappear. So it's a completely nonsense in evolution, but it's very important because mainly this is due to a very old conflict between the unicellular type of life and the multicellular type of life. So cancer is something like a reminding of this very old conflict between the situation in which you are a selfish cell and the situation in which you are a cell belonging to a collective, belonging to a cooperative system. So it's a conflict between these two logics. So this is another example.
Yeah, thank you.
We have a question in the online chat.
Sure. Someone is raising hand.
Okay.
They wrote the question. I don't know
They
what
changed
that
it.
is.
I can try to enter with my
Okay.
computer.
Okay.
Ah, si legge da là? Ah, ok.
Ah.
No.
Sure.
Okay. I would like to ask a question, if possible. What role does the punctuated equilibrium model have today in the study of evolution?
Okay. So I don't see that here. So just there. So punctuated, maybe no one knows what punctuated equilibria are. Punctuated equilibria is something related to what I said before. So when you have a geographic speciation, okay? So you have a larger population living in an ecological niche. Then you have a fragmentation of the habitat, for example, due to a climate change, as happened in Africa many times. Or you have rising the sea rising, or you have changing in the environment, you have new ecological barrier. Sometimes it could happen that the small population remains completely separated, and you have a branch in evolution. Due to the fact that the population is small, this is just statistical, in a small population, a new genetic variants can be fixed much rapidly, okay, more rapidly, okay, because it's small, because the population is small. When you have an adaptation in a small population, this adaptation can succeed in a very, very short time. So, punctuated equilibria is the result of this process at the paleontological level. If you are a paleontologist, if you observe this process, what you will see is that you will see a species in the main environment that is stable. So you will see in the strata of the geological stratification, we'll see a species stable for a long time, and sometimes very rapidly you will see a new species arising, so a new species emerging. This is punctuated equilibrium. So stability, equilibrium, with a punctuation. The punctuation is the rapid speciation due to what we call geographic speciation. So punctuational genealogy or punctuational phylogenies are phylogenies like our phylogeny that are very punctuated. So a lot of species with a lot of species emerging even for a short period of time and so on. So our evolution is a punctuated evolution. And we, as Homo sapiens, we are the last punctuation in Africa, one of the last punctuations in Africa, so one of the last branching evolution. So in order to answer the question, we don't think today that punctuated equilibria are all the evolutionary story, okay? Because in other cases, speciation could be slower, okay, could be more gradual. For example, when you have a huge species in a huge environment, you need more and more time in order to have a change. If selective pressures change, you will see in the paleontological record a slow change in a great population. This could happen. It's not so frequent, but it could happen. In many other cases, you will see a stable species and a new and other species branching in a very rapid way. So again, the evolutionary explanation is pluralistic. It depends on the cases. In some cases, in some ecological conditions, evolution could be gradual. In other conditions, depending on the situation, could be very rapid. The case of human phylogeny is very special because human phylogeny was really very, very branching. Just a comparison. If you look at the evolution of our closest cousin, so chimps, after the separation with our common ancestor, in 6 million of years, speciates 2 times. So today we had in the past 3 species of chimps, and today we have 2 species of chimps, bonobos and the great chimps, divided in varieties, okay? So not so branching evolution, okay? Just 3 species, today 2 with varieties. On the other side, if you look at the human evolution, so hominin evolution, today we count more than 27, maybe 28 different species, belonging to at least 4 or 5 genera. So a completely different story. On the one side, chimps, very conservative evolution. On the other side, hominins, explosive evolution of species. And today we are the last branch of this phylogeny, of this branch in phylogeny. Why? Because chimps and their ancestors remained in quite the same environment. So the western part of Africa, more humid with more precipitation, so rainforest, like bonobos, like chimps today, so more conservative evolution depending on the environment. We and our ancestors had to adapt to a much more an ever-changing environment in the eastern part of Africa and the northern part of Africa. So rainforest, then open spaces, then savannas, then so continuous change of habitats. And the result is new species. So for me, speciation is another wave of exploration of possibilities. When the environment changes, you have adaptation and also speciation, so the production of new species. Again, exploration of different possibilities depending on the change in the environment.
I have a question. Can I? Just 1 year ago, more or less.
You can say no.
You can say no, yeah. You are not a student, you can't do that. We were here and we talked about the golden rules for an effective communication. So my question is, what do you think is the future of science communication, and what are and will be the most effective tools or type of events to reach a wider audience? Because this is a topic, the science communication is in a tough moment.
Exactly. I'm involved in many projects of science communication in Italy and abroad. I think that today science communication is in a very critical period for many reasons, because we have a great change of languages with respect to Piero Angela and what we did 20 years ago, for example, with the science festivals that we organized in Genoa, in Bergamo, in many other towns in Italy, or if you think at the great science exhibition that we organized, they were more or less traditional projects of science communication. So you have to be interested and you have to go in a place where someone else designed a situation for a narrative about something, about evolution or astrophysics or whatever. Today, the situation is completely different. We have completely different kind of audiences. No young people no longer see TV, watch TV, for example. So the TV projects are devoted to people completely different. I was absolutely shocked to know from a sociological survey that people watching science in TV has an average age in Italy of 69. Okay, 69 average. So it means 80, okay, 80 and to 60 to 80, and the average is 69. So incredible. So when you are doing something in the TV, you have to think that you are talking to the elder part of our population. Young, as you of course use in the web and social and so on. So for me, that's the first challenge. We have to update our languages. Not always is easy because, for example, the language and the behavior that we have and that we see in the social networks, for me, usually are incompatible with a good science communication, okay, because they are too individualistic, too narcissistic in communication science. In science communication, for me, it's important to think always that you have to communicate something. So the content, science, and the precision of science is the first thing. Then you are a tool for science communication. But the main actor is not you, it's science. And the other point is that's shocking, is that according to sociological survey, because when we discuss about science communication, I think we have to avoid any personal, impressive situation. We have to think in terms of quantitative data. And if you look at the sociological survey about the audience of science communication projects in Italy, the traditional projects, they are always the same people. No more than 700,000 people in Italy follow science festival, science exhibition, TED Talks, and so on. So always the same people. They are a lot of people, 700,000 people, but they are a small minority of Italians. We have to find ways to reach all the other 49 millions of Italians, okay? So that's the point. For me, just to finish, one of the most interesting new tools is to design science communication projects in which you mix different languages. For me, it's important. Today, I spend my time only for science communication projects in which I mix my narrative with music, with theater, with graphic novel, with new languages, and visual, for example, poetic visual. I think music, I think it's the more effective way that we have today to explain science. And when you explain science through emotions, like with music, theater, the final Hefted is much more impressive, much more, it's stronger, even really stronger than the traditional projects of science communication. That's my idea today.
Thank you very much.
Okay, talking about science communication, would you like to talk more about Pikaia, maybe?
With pleasure. Do you know Pikaia? Pikaia, it's a very traditional project of science communication because it's a service website. It's a website as a service. But I think it's important because today in Italy we have two websites that are just service for people. One is Climalteranti about climate change and climate science, and one is Pikaia about evolution. So the main service of Pikaia is that if you are interested in evolution, once a week you can read Pikaia, and the board of Pikaia for you select the most important papers and news about evolution, and once a week in half an hour you can be updated about all is important in what it happened importantly in evolution in that week. So it's a service website. So this is an example of science communication that is still useful because we have an enlarging audience, likely, and so that's Pikaia. So Pikaia, pikaia.eu, and you can follow, and you can write, and you can collaborate. Okay, so we had a lot of young people doing the tutorship in Pikaia, so it's a collective, it's a community, Pikaia.
Very good. So, maybe we have any last question? Maybe? Yeah.
There's one. So I'm not in the field, but I became interested in evolution and ethology because I see the chance to better understand something about ourselves in these topics. And so we said we have been through a lot of changes in a limited in a limited time span. And we tend to, in this time span, we tend to change a lot our behavior, our lifestyle. We have different group dynamics, different stimuli. And I guess that especially in the modern area, we tend to be aware of our awareness and then link that to the fact that we should overcome or manage our instincts. So I guess that that's my opinion. In my opinion, it's really important to understand what our tendencies, because they are strictly related also to our satisfaction in life and our behavior. How much is this important, especially considering the fact that we are evolving in this limited time span? And yeah, how much is important, and it's related to how we feel in this type of society.
That's a great question, because thanks to this question, I can also add something that could be important for people here in this audience, for example, studying medicine or studying environmental issues and something like that. Because evolution is something related to the remote past, but evolution is very important in order to understand what is happening today. In the relationship between human species and environment, for example, we have seen about the niche construction process is an evolutionary tool in order to explain climate change, because climate change is a monumental process of niche construction, an evolutionary trap. So evolution can explain this. In order to answer this question, for example, in medicine, you can have due exactly to the different rates of evolution, because evolution in a biological level could be very slow, but the cultural level could be very rapid. Okay? So you can have what, for example, in medicine, what we call today an evolutionary mismatch. Something like a jet lag in evolution, something like that. What is an evolutionary mismatch? For example, take the case of obesity. We know today that evolution can say something about obesity because in our metabolic system, we studied at the genetic level that we still have in our biology very old adaptations related to very old behaviors that we had in the past, in the Pleistocene, when all humans were under hunters and gatherers, and the diet was much more fragmented and unpredictable than our diet. So in such a situation, when you are an hunter and gatherer, your metabolic system can and should evolve an adaptation in order to use all the resources that you can find, because you will not be sure when you will eat something new next time. So you have to use immediately or sugar and fat that you will find. This sugar and fat is very functional in such a situation. But when you have this adaptation that is slow to change, in a completely different cultural situation and social situation, when you are surrounded by fast food, restaurants, and supermarket, this adaptation, this old adaptation, becomes a misadaptation, becomes a problem for you, So this is a case in which evolutionary biology can help you in medicine. Another case, when you have pandemics and epidemics. What is an epidemic? A pandemic is a Darwinian process. You have a pathogen that is evolving new strategies to attack you as a host, and your immune system as a host responds to other selective pressures and other strategies. And you will see, exactly as we have seen during COVID-19, what we call an arms race between the pathogens and the immune system. This is a Darwinian evolution, exactly Darwinian evolution. Today we have a huge problem with the antibiotic resistance. So not viruses, but bacteria, the other side of the microbial world, that are the enemies of the viruses, because bacteria and viruses fight each other for billions of years. So antibiotic resistance has to be understood in evolutionary terms, because if you abuse of antibiotics, you are producing a selective pressures that can produce resistance in some strains of bacteria. It's an evolutionary process, okay, in order to answer the question. Again, in this case, we humans, we accelerate a process that could be very dangerous for us today, because for the new antibiotics, you need years and years, and you need a lot of funds, a lot of money, and in the meantime, bacteria are much rapid than you. Okay, so that's another way to use evolution. Another one, just last one, in order to answer the question, is the fact that our mind, our brain itself, is full of evolutionary predispositions. And it's better to know them in order to understand why, for example, we love some kind of explanation rather than others. For example, we know today that our brain has great predispositions, unfortunately, for teleological explanation. Teleological explanations are exactly the explanation that you find in the fake news, in the conspirational thinking, and this is an evolutionary reason why these fake news, unfortunately, are so successful and so viral, so able to have a mimetic diffusion in our brain. They colonize our brains. So if you understand this, you can produce antidotes like good science communication in order to understand that. Another wonderful discovery of that is related to racism and discrimination today, we discovered that our brain, not we discovered, but neuroscientists discovered in New York, discovered that our brain has, unfortunately, a strong predisposition to immediately, in a very instinct way, to distinguish people that can belong to your tribe, to your community, and separate these people to people that likely do not belong to your community, to your us. And this idea, so to be a little tribe against other tribes, is something very strong in our brain. And we know that this could be a biological predisposition for an excessive importance that you can do, that you can give to external phenotypic appearance, so like the color skin and something like that. So we have to study this in order to understand our biases, because if you know your bias, you can fight your bias and you can change your bias. Because, for example, in this experiment about racism, the title of the paper was very provocative, The Neuroscience of Race, because they say they discovered the possible basis of racism in our brain. But then they did the control experiment. And one of the control experiment was, okay, now the situation is that your brain has to see a face of someone different with respect to you, with a different skin color. So in a normal situation, if your brain, and if you check with the fMRI, the mapping of your brain, you see your brain with an immediate reaction of the amygdala, like saying, okay, this is not like me. This could be a problem for me. This is a trait for me. So the amygdala immediately fires. And then a third of a second later, that it's a long time, it's a very span of time for the brain, the neocortical cortex interacts with the amygdala, and you see something like a trade-off again, like a conflict in the brain. But if the same situation is in which a white man see an Afro-American man or woman in the screen and watching this face, the volunteer immediately understand that this guy in front of him or her is, for example, a great singer or a very famous basket player or football player, amygdala remains absolutely silent. And that's very interesting, because the only difference from the first experiment and the second is culture, is your education, is your family experience, is your what you like in sports and music. So culture. And this second part of the experiment is very interesting, because it's the proof that culture, education, your experience can change your biological reaction. So can change your feeling, your gut feeling, your deep feeling, your instinctive feeling. So this is one of the reasons why today, for example, we no longer speak about human instinct. We as humans, we don't have instinct. We have just natural predispositions and no more than that. And another proof, just the last one, that we have 2 months ago, it's wonderful, and it's related to gender topics. Maybe you know that in other nations, not in Italy, unfortunately, there are finally, at the end, a lot of fathers that take the paternal period from the work, and they are able to follow the baby, okay, for months and months. This is a new behavior for men, unfortunately. In other nations, now we have a statistical group of fathers that have this behavior, fortunately. So for the first time, my anthropologist colleague were able to study these men, these fathers. Expecting what? They expected to see, to observe cultural changes, behavioral changes, psychological changes. And this is true. They observed in these fathers all this stuff. But more than that, they discovered that in these fathers, the hormonal setting in the blood was completely different and became female. So in this case, a cultural change, so a behavioral change, was able to change the biology of the population. So culture can change biology. And this is also a proof of the fact that we as fathers, as men, already had the biological predisposition for the care, okay, for being careful about our babies. But millennia of patriarchal culture were able to silence, to put down this biological competence of men, of fathers. That's another interesting evolutionary discovery that is related to something that we will discuss every day in the present.
Thank you very much. And thank you also to all the people connected online, and we hope that we will follow also the other stage of this journey. And thank you to all the students, thank you for the question, and see you next week.